Childcare versus petrol stations. When you're looking at long-term investment with yield, security, and in key areas, a lot of times most people are thinking, should I invest in a childcare centre, should I invest in a petrol station? They're relatively the same, but there are some key differences. In this video today, I'm going to explore which one is a better option, but also what are the key highlights and differences of each type of properties. Now, childcare centres, petrol stations, let's look at it. On a broad spectrum, they have very similar traits. Number one, they are long-term tenants. So the tenants are very secure. They've invested a lot into the premise. Like, for example, childcare centres takes millions of dollars to build. Petrol station takes millions of dollars to build, right? So they have tenants that are there 20, 30, 50 years on leases. So very, very secure. Yields, relatively the same, but, not flash, hot, high-yielding properties, but secure, right? You're paying for the security. Key areas, normally childcare centres in suburbia, key demands of local areas, high density. That demand is what childcare centres are looking for. Petrol stations, traffic flow. So if you've got traffic flow of people, it is where most petrol stations are. Also, when we come to it, land holdings. Petrol stations as well as childcares have significant land holdings that in the future you might repurpose them. So broadly, childcare centres and petrol stations are really, really good comparisons. And when you look at price points, they're going to be above about that $5 million price point. So they're going to be between about $5 to $7 million for a purchase of a good childcare centre or a good petrol station. Now, can you get cheaper childcare centres between 2 to 3 million or petrol stations between 2 to 3 million? Of course you can. They're just further out, more into the regional areas. So if you buy in metro, they're going to be between about 5 to 7 million as sort of that medium range for a childcare to petrol station property. Or if you are willing to go regional, and depending on how far you go regional, in really remote rural areas, you can get petrol station for even less than $1 million and childcare for less than $1 million. But typically in large regional towns, you are going to be paying somewhere between 2 to 3 million for a good childcare centre or a petrol station. Now, what are the key differences? Now, childcare centres are mainly based because of the demand in the area. So when you are studying and researching and deciding whether you want to invest in a childcare centre, what you're looking for is that demand and also competition, right? You might start out in the beginning and you go, I'm the only childcare centre in the whole area. But however, after 3 to 5 years, you find there's another 3, 4, 5 childcare centres, and now your childcare centre may be underperforming and not filling up. And if your childcare centre doesn't fill up, your tenant is going to struggle to pay the rent. See, childcare centres are done per child. So the more you're able to fill the childcare centre, the better your tenant's going to be able to operate that business and be able to pay that rent more seamlessly. So when we're looking at childcare centres, you are looking for somewhere between 60 to 90 in metro area in terms of space for childcare places. Now, if you get to 120, that's even better. In metro areas, you need somewhere above 60 childcare spaces to make that childcare profitable, considering the size of the land, the rent, and all the maintenance, upkeep, staffing of it, right? So 90 is really that more happy sweet spot when you're in metro areas. Now, if you're in regional areas, they're going to be a lot smaller. They're not going to be able to fill a childcare centre with 120 spaces. For them, a lot of the smaller regional areas or rural areas, 60 is already a lot. In fact, you will find a lot of them are going to be between 45 to 60 kids, and some of them go up to 80 in large regional areas. So your large over 50,000 population, about 80 childcare centres are your larger childcare centres. So your sweet spot is going to be between somewhere around that 60 mark for a childcare centre that both service the community, good value for money, and also have a good reputation locally. So when you're in regional areas, that's what you need to shrink your expectation from metro into regional, but of course your price point shrinks as well. And now we talk about yield. Now, childcare centres at the moment has got really, really sharp yields, which means that in metro they're going to be sub 5%, which means they're going to be below 5%. And you might be saying, well, why would I invest in a childcare centre when it's going to be sub 5%? Well, the thing is, if you're investing in a childcare centre sub 5%, it is because you're looking at the longevity of a 20-year lease, potentially a 40-year lease, but also that you're really putting the money and holding the money for generational wealth, not really give you as much cash flow unless you're buying it with cash, and then it's going to give you that average amount of cash flow. However, the great thing about childcare centres is a triple net lease. The tenant takes care of all of your maintenance, outgoings, and everything else. So land tax, your management fees, but also things like repairing a roof, repairing, if there is like a leaky sand pit, or if there is things that need to be refurbished because of capital works, they take care of it as well, which saves you so much time, so much money, and it basically becomes set and forget. This is why people will take a lower yield in terms of accepting a childcare investment. Key things to look at when you're looking at a childcare investment that is fundamentally different from a petrol station. It is looking at the area and demand, but the future potential growth of that. Could your childcare center doesn't have enough land for it to grow, for outdoor indoor ratio? Can in the future it increase its childcare capacity from 60 to potentially 90 children, or even 60 to another 70 or 75 children, right? Even that change of 10 children can make a significant difference in the rent that your tenant is able to pay, and that's a nice little back end kicker as well. But also one of the key areas is that area growing? So is the value of that area growing, meaning the land that the childcare center is actually at growing? Because the land value, see, in the future you might find that it might be cheaper to buy a childcare center than to buy a house in a local area, because the value of the land has grown significantly. Now, this is not a short-term thing, it is more like a 10-20 year sight on why you would invest in a childcare center. So make sure, if you want more information and you're thinking that you want to invest in childcare centers, there's a particular type of due diligence you need to do on the reputation of the tenant, on the childcare facilities that they provide, whether it's suitable for the children, the ratio, plus things like the land they're on, and also all the environmental that is around them, and the demand and supply in that area. And that is a very specific DD. So if you're interested and you want to find out more, do connect with myself and my team here at Unicorn. We've helped our clients not only build childcare centers, invest in childcare centers, refurbish childcare centers, and also flip childcare centers. So if you're interested in all of that, do connect with that, helen@unicorn.com.au. Book in for that strategy session where we can take you through how to invest in a childcare center. Now let's talk about petrol stations. So petrol stations, right? Back 2-3 years ago, petrol stations really wasn't the thing. 2-3 years ago, everybody was into electric cars and no one wanted to invest in a petrol station. And the reason they didn't want to invest into a petrol station because they're worried about environmental contamination. We're not going to use petrol cars anymore. So all of that started to die out. And as a result of that, petrol stations became one of those things that people didn't want. However, 2 years from that time now, today in 2025, petrol stations are back in demand. A lot of demand for petrol stations right now, because people have realized that electric cars isn't going to be the end all and be all of everything. You're going to need trucks on the road. You're still going to need freight, and also that electric cars can become an environmental hazard or a burden in the future. Resale of electric cars has not been as strong as petrol cars, so people are slowly actually going back into petrol stations. Now, one of the key things about petrol stations is it is very, very similar to actually childcare centers. It is that petrol stations do have very long leases, 10, 20, 30-year leases. You have a tenant that is there for the long term who are invested in there, and it is also in key areas where you get a lot of foot traffic. Now, one of the key differences about childcare centers with petrol stations is petrol stations themselves are not dependent on in terms of your operator as much as childcare centers. Childcare centers, reputation is really important, and whether they do well for the actual children, it grows the center. However, petrol stations don't have that. Obviously, operators make a difference. However, if you're in key locations where people just have to stop before they actually move on to their holidays or they're driving, or it's a truckie stop, they're going to come regardless of if the operator is terrible in terms of their customer service, if they don't have the right in terms of food serving, or in terms of what they provide in the shops. They're still going to stop because it is location based and it's a traffic and they have to be there. So it's very, very much in demand. So you got to look at the traffic, you got to look at the demand, and you got to look at obviously the competition of other routes, and if there's going to be a bypass as well, right? So again, petrol stations, the other benefit of a petrol station is that potentially this land can be for redevelopment. A lot of people invest in petrol stations for future development, not immediately, 20 years from now, this area could be all full of residential properties and they could go high rises. Most petrol stations, they have land that allows you to go medium to high density, which means 6, 8, 10 stories. And that is why the land on petrol stations is so valuable, and that drives the return down along with that security. So it's almost like land banking with some money coming in until the day you're ready to develop. So why would someone invest in a petrol station versus a childcare center? Now, petrol stations is part of a fuel run. So we have invested in petrol stations for our clients. We have done petrol station build outs. We have helped them assess petrol stations. So again, if you're interested in investing in petrol stations, do leave us a note below, a comment below, or just simply email myself, helen@unicorn.com.au, and I can help you with the due diligence to purchase a petrol station, which is very different from childcare, because we've got to look at the land contamination, environmental hazard. We've got to assess when the tanks and how long it's been built. The leases are very, very different for a petrol station versus a childcare provider. Now, petrol stations, one of the big things you've got to look at is environmental contamination. Now, the bank is going to make you spend $20,000 on just due diligence and reports if you don't know what you're looking for. So to save that money, you really want an expert who's actually done it to be able to help you go through all the documentation. And a lot of times it's a lot of documentation in terms of testing, fuel tanks, when it was done, when it was relined, when it was tested, the soil. A lot of that is in the due diligence of it. So it's very specialized due diligence. However, the upside of it is you can actually have a very set and forget investment in a petrol station where the tenant itself may change hands multiple times. So a tenant may sell their business, which is the petrol station servo operator, to someone else, and your business continues to go no matter what. And it might actually get better if it gets taken up by a larger chain. Now, petrol stations, just like childcare stations, it's going to be somewhere between that 5 to 7 mil range if you're buying in key locations in metro areas. The yields are slightly better than childcare centers. It's probably going to be 0.5 to 1% better. So maybe between that 5%, 6% mark. But if you're in regional, they can be definitely higher into the 6%, and they can obviously be smaller in price points. So they could be in that 3 mil range for a petrol station in a large regional town. Of course, petrol stations in smaller regional areas and rural areas are going to be much cheaper, but just be careful that there's not a bypass and it's not a dying area, which is really, really important for petrol stations, that traffic flow, right? So now you understand that when you're looking at a petrol station, it's fundamentally different from a childcare center. So making a decision is depending on what you actually want in the future. If you're looking for set and forget properties that the tenant takes care of everything, just continues to chug along and have that security, and you don't have to worry about contamination, everything else, but you're buying in a key location, the land value being worth more, then childcare centers for you. If you are looking for something that you might develop or sell it to a developer in the future, something that has that natural in the future, that potential 10x effect, then a petrol station is for you. 20 years out, you've got to look that potential. This is a development site, so you've got to look at that demand as well. However, don't forget, you've got to do your due diligence, specialized for petrol stations. Again, here at Unicorn, we've seen almost everything in the market. So if you want to find out more about these specialist assets, do email me. Link is below, as well as my email address, so you can connect with me about how you can actually invest into these specialized assets. So if you are looking at future developments, you're looking at that a little bit higher in yield at the moment, and you don't mind spending some money and time on the research, then that very secure asset, that petrol station, is for you. So which one should you invest next, and what is some of your action steps? Well, if you decide to go down the road of doing petrol station or childcare centers, either one of those, make sure you have a very strong due diligence team. Make sure you understand the demand, but make sure you understand your numbers. The yields in the beginning is not going to be very, very good. It's going to be between that 4.5 to about 5.5 range for either one of these properties if they're in a metro area. If they're in a regional area, it's going to be that 5.5 to 6% if they're in a regional area. Now, you need to make sure you get your strategy right. You need to make sure you do your numbers and make sure that you actually have significant money to put into it, that this property breaks even, and that's usually about 45 to 50% of the purchase price of the property, so that this property isn't significantly negative and the bank can give you comfortable lending on it. So it's a hard decision. If you want a hand in how to make that decision, or whether none of those are right for you and something else, then either watch my next video about medical centers and shopping strips, or simply email me and let's talk about your strategy. My name is Helen Tarrant, and I help everyday Australians become wealthy through investing in commercial property. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.